Throughout history, wars were won not only by the strength of armies, but also by the brilliance of commanders. Sometimes a massive wooden horse brought down a city, sometimes a feigned retreat lured thousands into an ambush. On the battlefield, victory was often determined not by the clash of swords, but by the power of intellect and strategy. Now let's take a closer look at the most cunning and unforgettable tactics in history. Enjoy the video and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The Trojan Horse. The Trojan horse is considered one of the most famous deceptions in ancient mythology and is the strongest symbol of the collapse from within strategy. After a long siege and exhausted Trojans, the Greeks present a massive wooden horse as a gift, which the Trojans accept. Soldiers hidden inside the horse emerge at night, open the city gates, and thus enable the capture of the city. Although this story does not appear in Homer's Iliad, it reached wide audiences through Virgil's Aeneid and later Greco-Roman narratives. Its historicity remains debated, but strategically, the Trojan horse is a clever tactic that seeks to weaken the enemy's defenses from within, rather than through direct force. For success, the gift must be convincing. The defender's morale and vigilance must be low. The deception must be executed at the right time, and the external forces must be coordinated. Social factors, collective decision-making, curiosity, desperation, and belief in symbols facilitate the deception. However, if the deception is discovered, the insiders can be neutralized, or the target may approach with suspicion and foil the plan. Additionally, there are serious moral and reputational consequences. The Trojan horse is a powerful metaphor for strategic genius and the risks of deception. Feigned retreat. The feigned retreat is one of the craftiest and riskiest tactics frequently used in the history of warfare. A unit pretends to be defeated and panicked to lure the enemy into pursuit. The aim is to disrupt the enemy's formation and draw them into a prearranged ambush or trap. Disciplined armies often break into uncontrolled pursuit when victory seems possible, and this psychological weakness is exploited. The Mongols, especially the armies of Genghis Khan, used this tactic masterfully to ambush much larger enemy forces. However, the success of a feigned retreat requires absolute discipline. The line between staged panic and real panic is very thin. If troops overplay their role or genuinely rout, the tactic can backfire. Experienced enemy commanders may detect such deceptions. Therefore, feigned retreats are only effective when timed correctly, under strong leadership, and in suitable terrain. Double flank envelopment, or cunning type encirclement. Double flank envelopment is a classical maneuver aiming to draw the enemy into the center and then encircle and annihilate them from both flanks. The most famous example is Hannibal's Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. The commander deliberately makes the center appear weak or retreating to entice the enemy to attack there. The flank units are held wide and strong. Once the enemy is committed to the center, the flanks close rapidly, squeezing the enemy and cutting off escape routes. Success requires high discipline, timing, unit coordination, suitable terrain, and correctly reading the enemy's aggressiveness. Risks include the enemy holding in the center and breaking the flanks failing to close in time, or poor timing allowing the surrounded force to escape. Double flank envelopment is a classic example of concentrating force, maneuver, and tactical deception to target the enemy as a whole. Fireships. Fireships were a dramatic and destructive naval tactic used especially in the Age of Sail. Ships that could be sacrificed were packed with gunpowder, pitch, oil, timber, tar, and similar inflammable materials and set adrift toward the enemy fleet, taking into account wind and current. The goal was to panic the enemy fleet and, if possible, set their ships ablaze without engaging in direct combat. A famous example is the English use of fireships against the Spanish Armada in 1588. Success depends on wind direction, timing, and the enemy's state of readiness. Otherwise, the vessels may be ineffective or endanger friendly forces. Fire ships represent a classic example of creative and psychological warfare. Empty city stratagem. The empty city stratagem aims to deter the enemy from attacking by deliberately appearing defenseless and abandoned, presenting weak or non-existent defensive forces, leaving gates open, and a commander's calm demeanor lead the opponent to suspect a trap and withdraw. The best-known example is attributed to Zhuge Liang during China's Three Kingdoms period. With few troops and limited resources, he opened the gates and calmly played the role of unconcerned leader, causing the enemy to retreat. The tactic exploits the enemy's caution, suspicion, and fear. For success, the opponent's character must be well read, and the appearance of weakness must be convincing. Modern equivalents appear in information operations and psychological warfare. Scorched earth. Scorched earth is the strategy of deliberately destroying all resources while retreating to hinder the enemy's advance. Barracks, crops, water sources, bridges, and shelters are destroyed. The goal is to disrupt the enemy's supply lines and increase their logistical burden. The most famous historical example is the Russians' evacuation and burning of Moscow in 1812, which condemned Napoleon's army to hunger and cold. The Soviets applied similar strategic destruction during retreats in World War II. Implementation involves planned evacuation, destruction or removal of resources, and sometimes forced civilian displacement. However, beyond strategic benefits, this tactic carries heavy humanitarian and economic costs. Under modern international law, scorched earth actions that disproportionately target civilians can constitute a war crime.
Controlled flooding, water flooding tactic. The water flooding tactic relies on creating controlled inundations in defense. Rivers, ponds, or canals are redirected, dikes opened or dams broken, so that the enemy's advance becomes difficult. Throughout history, it has been used effectively in sieges in China and Europe, undermining the effectiveness of castles or forcing enemy forces to adapt. In addition to creating a physical barrier, flooding applies psychological pressure. The enemy suffers morale loss while attempting to advance across muddy, marshy, or flooded terrain. However, incorrect application can endanger the defending side. In modern military engineering, control of water still holds strategic importance. Sapping and mining, trench and tunnel tactics. Sapping and tunnel tactics are used to weaken castles or defensive lines under siege from beneath. The attacker digs trenches and tunnels while approaching the enemy walls, undermining foundations or collapsing them with explosives. This method was frequently used in ancient Rome, the Middle Ages, and the early modern period, offering a safer and often more effective alternative to direct assault. It also carries moral and psychological pressure. Defenders may panic when faced with a continuous subterranean threat. Successful operations require engineering knowledge, analysis of underground conditions, disciplined workmanship, and proper timing. Modern military engineering applies similar principles, but within the limits of international law and civilian safety. Using animals as weapons. Animals have been used throughout history for direct assault, logistics, and psychological purposes. Elephants, horses, dogs, geese, or birds were employed to break enemy lines, demoralize forces, or perform reconnaissance and transport tasks. The psychological impact of war elephants in ancient India and Carthage was immense. In the Middle Ages and later periods, horses and mules carried supplies, while dogs and birds served in scouting and attack roles. While animal use offered advantages, loss of control could harm friendly forces. Modern technologies have largely replaced these functions, but historical examples show the importance of strategic creativity and using the environment. Disease and biological pressure. Disease and biological pressure represent some of the darkest and most effective tactics used to create fear, panic, and weakness in an enemy. This method involved leaving diseased corpses, animal carcasses, or contaminated materials in enemy living areas or besieged cities. Documentation exists of intentional spread of plague, typhus, and other epidemics during sieges in the Middle Ages. The tactic aims to debilitate the enemy and break morale. However, uncontrolled contagion can also threaten the user. Today, the use of biological agents as weapons is banned by international law. Strategically, disease and biological pressure aim to gain psychological and logistical advantage rather than engage in direct combat. Camouflage and shadow/guerrilla warfare. Camouflage and shadow warfare encompass strategies to move unseen, conduct surprise attacks, and safely carry out reconnaissance. Soldiers and equipment are concealed with colors or natural coverings that blend into the environment, avoiding enemy sight. This has been applied from the Middle Ages to the present, especially in forested, mountainous, or urban terrain. Shadow warfare requires silence, patience, and the ability to predict enemy behavior. Historical examples include Japanese ninjas, medieval European sharpshooters, and modern special forces. Advantages include opportunities for sudden strikes and moral superiority. However, once concealment is compromised, the tactic becomes a liability. Camouflage remains critically important in modern military operations. Economic and logistical disruption and market warfare. Economic and logistical disruption aims to weaken the enemy by targeting their resources and supply lines. This can involve blocking the supply of food, weapons, fuel, and ammunition, cutting trade routes, or exerting pressure on financial markets. Examples range from ancient Rome's systematic cutting off of enemy city resources to destruction of production areas in the Middle Ages, to modern-day embargoes and logistical sabotage. The goal is to reduce the enemy's combat capacity and damage morale. These methods provide strategic advantage without direct confrontation, but require extensive planning, intelligence, and coordination. In contemporary international politics, energy and raw material embargoes, targeting supply chains, and financial pressures are current forms of this strategy.